Fractured Pathways. Generated by StoryWave.ai. Tap the like button and subscribe for more.
Chapter 1. Chained Whispers. I remember the precise moment my world fractured, the day I traded sunlight for shadows and the caress of the wind for the cold embrace of iron chains. The chains were not merely iron, they were etched with the despair of their previous captives, a tapestry of silent screams. This manor, with its grandeur and whispers of nobility, became my gilded cage. My hands tremble as I recount these events. The quill is my sole confidant, skittering across the pages like a frantic prisoner seeking escape. Lord Griffin, cloaked in the guise of an esteemed nobleman, has fashioned a world beneath his estate where the darkness is not simply an absence of light, but an entity in itself. A perversion of grandeur, where the walls echo with the muffled cries of the damned, and the air is heavy with the stench of despair. He calls me Eve, a cruel jest, as if my emaciated form could bear any semblance to the mother of humanity. The day my path veered into ruin began like any other, but the sun's warmth was deceitful, belying the horror that would unfold. The Lord's men came for me at dawn, their hands as unyielding as the fate they delivered. My pleading fell on deaf ears. This new life was thrust upon me, the title of handmaiden a thin veneer over the reality of my captivity. Each day, the manor reveals more of its macabre secrets. The Lord's collection of knives is not merely for show. Their blades have tasted more than just the delicacies that grace his table, and his charm, which flows as freely as the vintage wines he boasts of, masks a cruelty that is as casual as it is calculated. His eyes, the color of steel, seem to dissect my very soul, and his voice, oh, that voice, it commands with an ease that chills the marrow in my bones. Evelyn is no more. She is a specter, a whisper of the girl who once dreamed of love and life beyond the confines of servitude. This journal, these pages, they are the last vestige of her existence. I write by the dim flicker of a candle, its flame a solitary sentinel against the encroaching darkness. The walls of this cellar are damp, the air fetid with mold and the lingering echoes of sorrow. The stone beneath me, unforgiving and cold, leaches the warmth from my body. I am clothed in rags that barely serve to preserve my modesty, let alone offer any solace from the chill. The other handmaidens avoid my eyes, their own gazes hollow, their spirits broken long before I arrived. We are united only in our shared plight, each of us a thread in the dark tapestry of Lord Griffin's twisted desires. Sometimes, in the darkest hours, I allow myself the indulgence of hope. I imagine a life reclaimed, a future where the chains no longer bite into my flesh and my voice can rise above a whisper. But as the dawn approaches, I smother such thoughts. They are dangerous. Hope is a luxury that can lead to the unraveling of the mind. I have seen what becomes of those who cling too fervently to such fancies. There is one among us, a girl with fire-kissed hair and a spirit that not even the ravenous baron could fully extinguish. She speaks in secretive voices of rebellion, of a world beyond these walls where freedom is more than a cruel illusion. Her words weave a dangerous spell, and I find myself ensnared by the possibility, by the sheer audacity of her dreams. Yet, I know the cost of such dreams. The consequences are etched into the flesh of those who dared to challenge the order of this place. To dream is to invite punishment, to draw the ire of our captor and the merciless retribution that follows. So I write. I document the descent, the slow erosion of my identity, the daily atrocities that chip away at what remains of my humanity. These journal entries may never find an audience. They may languish in the darkness, as I surely will. But as long as the ink flows and the pages turn, there is a history to my existence, to the truth that lies beneath the splendor of this cursed estate. I am Evelyn Hartley, and this is my descent into the abyss. Chapter 2. The Gilded Cage. In the underbelly of the manor, where the stone is cold and the air reeks of mildew, my existence is a stark antithesis to the grandeur that sprawls above. The echo of my chains is a grotesque melody that plays in mocking tandem with the harmonious laughter that drifts down from the halls. Yet this night, the manor above beckons with a deceptive gleam. Through a clandestine slit in the cellar wall, a cruel window to the world I've been torn from, the dinner party unfolds. The sight is a visual symphony of opulence, crystal goblets glinting with the dance of candlelight, silverware laid with precision beside plates of the finest porcelain adorned with a feast that could sate the hunger of 100 souls. The nobility swirls in a parade of silks and satins, their voices a blend of mirth and indulgence. I watch, unseen, as Evelyn, the girl who once dreamed beyond the confines of servitude, now a ghost of that very dream. The clink of chains against the damp floor, a stark reminder of my reality as I shift for a better view. Lord Griffin presides over the gathering with the ease of a conductor before his orchestra. His laughter, rich and deep, fills the room and masks the sinister undertones that only I seem to hear. Evelyn's eyes, hazel orbs that once held the light of stars, are now dimmed, reflecting the tarnished soul within. At the table, a woman with a laugh like silver bells leans forward, her emerald gown hugging curves with an elegance that speaks of generations of wealth. "Griffin, darling," she purrs, "your soirees are always the talk of the county. But tell me, what's your secret? Your staff is practically invisible, yet everything is perfect." Griffin's steel-gray eyes flash with a hidden knowledge as he sips from his goblet. "My dear Lady Harrowgate, a manor runs on the silence of its servants. The less seen, the more efficient the service," he replies with a smile that doesn't quite reach his eyes. Another guest, a portly gentleman with a ruddy complexion that speaks of many a night spent at the dinner table, chortles. "Well, I say, efficiency be damned. I want to know the name of your chef. This venison is divine. Cooks with this sort of talent deserve recognition." A shadow crosses Griffin's features, subtle enough that none but the keenest of observers would notice. "Ah, my culinary team is quite exclusive. I fear they're shy of accolades. But your praise is noted, and I shall pass it along," he says, his voice smooth as the velvet drapes that frame the grand windows. Evelyn, from her cramped vantage point, feels a sickness churn in her belly that has naught to do with hunger. The meat, so lauded above, carries with it a heaviness that no spiced sauce can mask. The opulence of the manor, its gilded facade, harbors a darkness far more consuming than the absence of light in her prison. As the laughter and conversation flow like the wine from the bottles, a new guest catches my focus. He is a young man, not yet touched by the cynicism of age, with eyes the color of the summer sky. His voice carries an enthusiasm that resonates with a sincerity long forgotten in these halls. "Evelyn," he whispers, his voice barely reaching my ears. "I've heard whispers, you know. The staff talks. They say there's more to this manor than meets the eye." A shiver courses through me, and I wonder if he speaks of the same whispers that haunt my chains. "And what do they say?" I ask, my voice a ghostly echo in the stone chamber. He leans closer, the scent of the feast above clinging to his finery. "They say the walls themselves are hollow, filled with the sighs of the lost, that the baron's wealth is lined with secrets darker than the cellars that store his wine." His gaze is intense, seeking. I nod, a hollow gesture. "Secrets are the currency of the manor. Some are priceless, others are debts paid in flesh and blood." The young man's eyes widen with a dawning horror. "You mean to say—" "Hush now," I interrupt with an urgency born of fear. "These walls, hollow they may be, have ears that hear far more than they should." The dinner party above reaches a crescendo of gaiety, the laughter a mocking counterpoint to the silent exchange below. The young man stands, his expression a tapestry of questions and dread. "I must know more," he says, determination etching his youthful features. Evelyn, the phantom of the cellar, watches him ascend. The gilded cage of the manor looms, its beauty a merciless veneer that conceals the abyss beneath. The true horror, she knows, lies not in the darkness of her chains, but in the blinding light above, where the darkness is draped in finery and feasts on the innocence of the unsuspecting. And as the quill scratches across the parchment, the journal grows heavy with the weight of untold truths, and the path to ruin unfurls like the petals of a poisoned rose, beautiful and deadly in equal measure. Chapter 3. The Devil's Feast. The manor's belly is a chasm of secrets, where the gluttony of opulence above gnaws at the very foundations of morality. It was upon a night shrouded in the deceptive embrace of the new moon that the latest soul was drawn into the spider's web. A girl, no more than 14, with hair the color of autumn leaves and eyes wide with an innocence, yet untainted by the world's cruelties. I remember Evelyn, now a mere shadow within these walls, watching the scene unfold from her prison of despair. The young girl was ushered through hallowed halls, her steps hesitant, her gaze flickering with the flicker of candles that lined the path to her unknown fate. Griffin's voice broke the silence of the cellar, its timbre resounding through the floorboards as he welcomed the newcomer. "Ah, you must be Abigail, our newest flower in the garden. Fear not, child, for here you shall bloom." Abigail's voice, a tremulous melody of youth, carried a note of bewilderment. "I thank you, Lord, but I must confess, this is all very overwhelming." Griffin's laugh, a sonorous cloak that masked the dagger beneath, echoed through the stonework. "Overwhelming indeed, but you'll find your place amongst the finery soon enough. Here, every desire is but a whisper away." In the cellar's murk, Evelyn's fingers tightened around her quill, the instrument of her torment and her only solace. The quill's scratch against parchment became a frantic race to capture the unfolding tragedy, each word a stone laid on the path to perdition. It was later, as the manor's guests reveled in their excesses, that Evelyn first heard the murmurs of Abigail's fate. Two maids, their faces etched with the weariness of servitude, chatted in silent whispers as they passed the hidden slit in the cellar wall. One, a woman with hair the shade of soot and eyes clouded by servitude, whispered, "The young one, Abigail, Lord Griffin has plans for her, so he does." Her companion, a slight figure with hands calloused from unending toil, replied, "And what plans might those be? The same as the others before her, to disappear like a wisp of smoke in the night?" The first maid shook her head, her voice tinged with an unspoken dread. "Worse, I fear. There's talk of a feast, one unlike any other, where the guests are as much a part of the menu as the food they consume." Evelyn's breath caught in her throat, a silent gasp that suffocated against the weight of implication. The Devil's Feast, they called it, a banquet where the lines between predator and prey blurred. The days that followed were a macabre tableau. Abigail, now garbed in the silks of the manor, was paraded before the elite, her laughter a hollow echo of the joy that had once filled her world. The guests, adorned in their finery, lavished attention upon her, ignorant or indifferent to the darkness that lurked in the corners of their paradise. It was on the eve of the feast that Evelyn overheard Griffin in conversation with a guest, a man whose wealth was eclipsed only by his insatiable appetite for the perverse. Griffin's voice was a silken thread laced with venom. "Tonight, my friend, you shall partake in a delicacy that transcends the mundane offerings of flesh and wine. We dine on the essence of purity itself." The guest, his jowls quivering with anticipation, replied, "Your words tantalize, Griffin. I have sampled the finest the world has to offer, but your promises hint at a satisfaction yet to be savored." "Patience," Griffin soothed, "for the culmination of your desires shall be revealed at the stroke of midnight. And I assure you, it is worth the wait." Evelyn, quill poised, chronicled the veiled horrors that seeped from the manor's gilded facade. The pages of her journal bore witness to the perversion of innocence, the consumption of light by the insatiable maw of darkness. The night of the feast arrived, cloaked in a decadence that masked the abomination at its core. Abigail, now the centerpiece of this grotesque tableau, sat resplendent in a gown of crimson, her eyes reflecting the flames that danced upon the silverware and the hungry gazes of the guests. In the cellar, Evelyn's chains seemed to tighten, the iron a physical manifestation of the despair that threatened to crush her spirit. Her journal, a history to the soul's endurance against the tide of wickedness, was now a flare of truth in a sea of lies. As the clock chimed the onset of midnight, a silence descended upon the manor. The guests, their faces wrapped with a morbid curiosity, turned their attention to the head of the table, where Griffin stood, his smile a gash in the fabric of civility. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice a serpent's hiss, "tonight we partake in an offering that transcends the carnal. We dine on the divine." Evelyn's pen stilled, the ink a pool of dread. The veil had been lifted, the Devil's Feast revealed in its unholy entirety, and as the first cry shattered the silence, she knew that the path to ruin had claimed another soul, and the manor's appetite for destruction was far from sated. Chapter 4. Echoes of innocence. In the bowels of the manor, where despair clung to the walls like dampness to the stones, I, Evelyn, sat shrouded in the vestiges of my former life. The cellar was a living tomb, where my breaths came in short gasps, each one an echo of the innocence that had been devoured within these cursed confines. My fingers, stained with ink and desperation, scrawled the truth of my revelations onto the worn pages of my journal. I had come to a harrowing conclusion. The feasts above were a macabre charade, a stage where the nobility gorged on more than just the food. The terror that gripped my heart was the realization that one day I might not be the chronicler of these horrors. I might become the centerpiece. The latest captive was a boy, no more than 17, with a mop of unruly hair and eyes that still held a spark of defiance. His name was Thomas, and he bore the naivety of one unacquainted with the darkness of the world. I saw him shackled, much like myself, but his chains were new, gleaming in the dim candlelight that barely penetrated our shared hell. I waited for the guard's footfalls to fade into silence before I whispered to Thomas across the shadowy expanse that separated us. "You must listen," I urged, my voice a mere wisp of sound. "The feasts, they are not what they seem. You are in grave danger here." Thomas's eyes widened, the flicker of defiance giving way to dawning horror. "What do you mean?" "I'm just a stable boy. They said I was to serve the guests." I shook my head, my chest tightening with each word. "It's a ruse. You are not here to serve. You are here to be served upon in ways too vile for the sane mind to comprehend." His lips parted, but before he could respond, the sound of approaching boots silenced us. The guards, their faces masks of indifference, descended upon us like birds of prey. With rough hands, they dragged me from my clandestine alcove and thrust me into a new chamber, smaller, devoid of even the sliver of light from the outside world. In this new confinement, the darkness was absolute, pressing upon me with the weight of the earth itself. My only company was the skittering of rats and the drip of water from unseen crevices. I was left with nothing, no quill, no parchment, nothing but the relentless march of my thoughts. It was in this oppressive solitude that I resolved to overcome the paralysis of my fear. I would not wait for the fate that had befallen so many before me. I would escape, or I would perish in the attempt. Hours bled into days, or perhaps it was weeks. The passage of time was an elusive specter in the absence of light. I traced the contours of my prison, my hands mapping the rough-hewn stones, searching for a weakness, a chink in the manor's armor. At long last, my fingers grazed something unexpected, a loose stone. Working in the pitch black, I coaxed the stone from its resting place, revealing a sliver of light from the world beyond. My heart hammered with a mixture of elation and terror as I peered through the gap. This was my chance, however slim. I was plotting my next move when a voice broke the silence, a sound so unexpected that I stifled a scream. It was Thomas, his words a lifeline in the abyss. "Evelyn," he called softly. "Are you there?" I pressed my face to the opening, whispering back, "Yes, I'm here. I've found something, a way out, perhaps." "We must be cautious," Thomas replied, the fear in his voice belying his words. "The guards are vigilant, and Lord Griffin, he is not a man to cross." I nodded, though he could not see. "We have but one life, Thomas. To remain here is to embrace death. We must risk everything for the mere chance of freedom." Our exchange was a warning in the darkness, a fragile thread of hope spun from the courage to defy our captor. We planned, in muttered voices, each detail a precious gem to be hoarded and polished until it gleamed with the promise of liberation. But fate is a capricious master, and our plan was not to be. The discovery of the loose stone by a guard during a routine inspection sealed our doom. The stone was replaced, the light extinguished, and our punishment was swift and severe. Yet, even as I lay in the dark, my body racked with pain from their retribution, I clung to the echoes of innocence that Thomas and I had shared. They could chain my body, but my resolve remained unbroken. I would find a way to warn the others, to thwart Griffin's twisted designs, or my name was Evelyn Hartley. And so, in the silence of my cell, I plotted anew. Each setback was a lesson, each moment of despair a challenge to be overcome. The manor, with its gilded facades and sumptuous feasts, was a fortress of depravity, but even the mightiest fortress has its weaknesses. I would find them or die in the quest. For now, the echoes of innocence were all I had, but they would suffice. They would have to. Chapter 5. The Ravenous Gaze. The air in the cellar was thick with the scent of mold and rust, and it clung to the stones like a second skin. In my secluded corner, shrouded by darkness, my thoughts raced, each one a frantic beat against the prison of my ribcage. I knew the truth now. The manor was not just a residence of aristocracy, but a playground for the depraved, and Griffin, the conductor of this macabre orchestra, had set his ravenous gaze upon me. It happened during one of his rare visits to the cellar, where the likes of me were kept out of sight. His footsteps were soft, a whisper against the harshness of the stone floor, belying the gravity of his presence. I felt him before I saw him, a shift in the air, a drop in the temperature, as if the very earth knew to hold its breath. "Evelyn," he called, his voice a silken thread laced with danger, "come forth." I emerged from the shadows, my movements measured, my heart a drum of war in my chest. Griffin stood before me, a sable cloak draped over his broad shoulders, his eyes like chips of ice as they appraised me. "You've been quite the scribe, my dear," he said, his tone deceptively soft. "Your words have painted quite the picture of our little gatherings." I swallowed hard, my throat a barren landscape against the effort. "I write only what I see, my lord," I replied, my voice a fragile thing threatened by the storm of my fear. Griffin chuckled, the sound a discordant note that echoed against the walls. "And what is it you see, Evelyn? Tell me, what visions do your eyes behold in the depths of their despair?" The question was a trap, and we both knew it. Yet I could not silence the truth that clawed its way up from my soul. I see a manor that feasts on the innocent, a nobleman who delights in the hunt of the most dangerous game. The air between us crackled with the tension of a storm about to break. Griffin's gaze pierced me, a predator assessing its quarry. Very poetic, Evelyn. But you see, the hunt you speak of, it requires a certain finesse, a prey worth the chase. His words slithered around me, a serpent's embrace. I knew then, with a certainty that was a cold hand around my heart, that I was marked. I was the next quarry in Griffin's twisted sport. "You flatter me, my lord," I managed, each word a stone in my mouth. "But I am no one of consequence. A mere handmaiden." Griffin stepped closer, the scent of his cologne a noxious cloud that belied the stench of his soul. "Oh, but you are, Evelyn. You are a rare bird, one that has seen the gilded cage and yet sings of freedom." I recoiled, my back pressing against the damp stone, as if I could merge with the walls and escape his scrutiny. "What is it you want from me?" I asked, my breath a plume of fog in the cold air. His smile was a gash in the dark, a slice of moonlight that promised nothing but pain. "I want to see you fly, Evelyn, and when you do, I shall be there to clip your wings." The encounter was brief, but it left me with a dread that filled my veins like ice. Griffin turned and left as silently as he had come, leaving me to contemplate the grim theater in which I was to play the lead. In the days that followed, the cellar became my crucible. Each clank of my chains was a knell that tolled for the end of my days. I could feel Griffin's eyes upon me, even when he was not present, a constant surveillance that left me exposed and vulnerable. I knew that my time was running short, that the manor was a labyrinth with a minotaur at its heart, and I, the unwitting Theseus, without a thread to guide me back to the light. My thoughts turned to escape, to a plan that was as desperate as it was necessary. The chance came on a night when the manor was silent, the guests and their debauchery a mere memory. The guard, a man with a face as impassive as the stone that imprisoned me, had grown lax in his duties. I watched him from the corner of my eye, his head nodding in the soporific embrace of sleep. With a heart that thrummed like a bird's wing against the bars of its cage, I slipped from my restraints, marks left by years of confinement, and approached the guard. My hands, though trembling, were sure as they relieved him of his keys and his consciousness with a swift, silent apology. The corridors of the manor were a maze of shadows and silence, each step a dance with death. I clung to the walls, a wraith in the darkness, as I made my way towards the promise of the outside world. But fate is a fickle mistress, and my escape was not to be. As the first light of dawn kissed the horizon, I was found, my flight an Icarian dream that ended with the harsh reality of Griffin's talons closing around me once again. The punishment was swift, a searing pain that engraved his warning upon my flesh. And as I was returned to my cell, my body broken but my spirit unyielded, I knew that the ravenous gaze of Lord Griffin would haunt me until the end of my days. I was the prey in a hunt that would not cease until one of us lay dead, and in the depths of my soul I vowed it would not be me. Chapter 6: Shadows of the Mind. The days melded into a singular, continuous nightmare from which I could not awaken. The grandeur of the estate, a festering lie that cloaked the vile truth, pressed upon my psyche, each ornate cornice and gilded frame a mocking testament to the horrors veiled beneath. The walls, adorned with tapestries depicting pastoral scenes, seemed to sneer at me with the knowledge of the suffering they concealed. My mind, once a fortress, now buckled under the relentless siege of terror. Sleep, when it deigned to visit, brought no respite, for it was riddled with visions too grotesque for daylight's mercy. Evelyn, once a handmaiden of some esteem, became a mere shade, flitting through the manor, a ghost trapped in a purgatory of flesh and blood. It was during one of these haunted reveries that I overheard a conversation that would shatter the fragile veneer of hope I had dared to cultivate. Two of Lord Griffin's associates, their forms wrapped in velvet and fur, their voices a low rumble of malice, stood in the corridor discussing their recent indulgences. "Did you hear about the painter?" one inquired, his words slurred by the excesses of the evening. "They say his talents were exceptional." His companion, a tall figure with a hawkish nose and eyes like chips of flint, chuckled. "Exceptional indeed, but not quite palatable to Griffin's tastes. A shame, really. The man had a gift for capturing the human form." They laughed, a sound that scraped along my nerves like jagged claws. "Capturing, indeed," the first replied, "though I suppose now he's become part of the manor's illustrious history in a more literal sense." Their laughter echoed through the manor, a sinister symphony that underscored the symposium of sin conducted within these walls. I retreated into the shadows, my heart a leaden weight in my chest. The painter, a man whose only crime was the pursuit of beauty through his art, now reduced to a mere anecdote between monsters. Despair clawed at my insides, rendering my already fragile composure to tatters. The realization that none were safe, that all who entered the manor were but pawns in Griffin's cruel game, was a poison that leached color from the world. I felt the last vestiges of my sanity fray, each thread unraveling with the understanding that escape was a fool's errand. In the depths of my solitude, I found myself conversing with the darkness as if it were an old acquaintance. "What do you want from me?" I whispered into the void, half expecting an answer from the gloom that surrounded me. The silence that greeted me was a balm and a curse. It offered no judgment, yet provided no counsel. I was alone, utterly and irrevocably, in a battle against a mind that threatened to betray me at every turn. The shadows seemed to coil around me, a cold embrace that promised oblivion, and I found myself longing for its touch. It was in this nadir of my existence that a sliver of light intruded upon my despondence. A new captive, a boy with eyes the color of the stormy sea, was thrust into the cell adjacent to mine. His name was Simon, and he carried with him a spark that the manor had yet to extinguish. Our exchanges, whispered through the stone that divided us, were a lifeline in the suffocating darkness. Simon spoke of the world outside, of the rolling hills and the freedom of the open sky. His words painted a picture so vivid that for a fleeting moment I could almost feel the sun's warmth on my skin. "Evelyn," he said, his voice a balm to the wounds that marred my spirit, "we cannot let this place consume us. We must hold on to who we are, cling to the memories of better days." I clung to his every word, a drowning woman grasping at flotsam in a roiling sea. "But how?" I asked, the question a ragged thing that clawed its way out. "How do we hold on to ourselves when every day a piece of us is eroded by this place?" Simon's reply was a soft murmur of defiance. "By remembering the good, by cherishing the light within us. We are more than this, Evelyn. We are not just the sum of our suffering." His conviction was a beacon, yet as the days passed, that beacon flickered and waned. The manor, with its insatiable hunger for torment, sought to snuff out even the smallest flame of resistance. Simon's voice grew weaker, his spirit succumbing to the relentless tide of despair that the manor exuded. And when his voice fell silent, when the stormy sea within his eyes stilled to a somber gray, I knew that the shadows had claimed another. The path to ruin was a one-way street, and all who traveled it were destined for the same dark end. I sat in the darkness, my back against the cold stone, and closed my eyes. The shadows whispered their siren song, and I listened, for there was nothing else left. The echoes of innocence were now just a distant memory, and I, Evelyn, was alone with the shadows of my mind. Chapter 7: Betrayal of Flesh. The musty, stagnant air of the cellar clung to my pores as I emerged into the starkly contrasting environment of the manor's kitchen. The gleaming surfaces of copper pots and polished utensils stood as silent sentinels to the grotesque task set before me. Griffin, draped in his usual attire of deceptive nobility, approached with a chilling calmness that belied the monstrous request he was about to impart. "Evelyn," he began, his tone casual, as though discussing the weather or some other banal topic, "your unique perspective has granted you a special opportunity." I stood there, my fingers involuntarily curling into fists at my sides, the memory of my previous defiance and its painful consequences still fresh. And what would that be? My voice was steady, but the revulsion within churned like a tempest. A smile, sharp and knowing, crept across his lips. "You will assist in the preparation of tonight's feast. Consider it an honor, a chance to serve in a capacity befitting your talents." The implications of his words coiled around me, a serpent's embrace, squeezing the breath from my lungs. The feast. I had come to understand the significance of that term, a euphemism for the horrors that occurred when the manor's grand dining room doors closed behind the elite. And if I refuse? The question was a mere formality, the illusion of choice in a world where autonomy had been stripped from me along with so much else. Griffin's eyes narrowed, the steel gray of them glinting with something feral. "Then you'll find your role in the feast considerably less palatable." The threat hung in the air, an unspoken ultimatum that left a metallic taste in my mouth. I was cornered, the instinct to survive warring with a moral compass that spun wildly, no longer able to find true north within the manor's corrupted walls. With a nod that felt like a betrayal of my very soul, I agreed to his demands. The kitchen staff, a cadre of gaunt figures who had long since surrendered to the will of the manor, paid me no mind as I took my place among them. Each task assigned to me was a descent further into the abyss. The slicing of meat, the mixing of herbs, the simmering of sauces, a symphony of the damned. Among the clatter of the kitchen, a voice reached me, barely above the hiss of the stove. It was Beatrice, the head cook, a woman whose once robust frame had withered under the strain of her duties. "Evelyn," she said, her tone a mixture of sympathy and resignation, "do not let this place rob you of who you are. You must endure, find solace in whatever small acts of rebellion you can." Her words, meant to be a comfort, were a grim reminder of the complicity forced upon us all. "How can I?" I replied, my hands coated in the evidence of my forced betrayal, when with every task I feel a piece of myself slipping away. Beatrice's eyes, dark wells of sorrow, met mine. "By remembering that this," she gestured to the kitchen around us, "is not the sum total of our existence. We are more than the actions we are compelled to perform." The conversation was cut short as the doors to the dining room swung open, signaling the time to present the feast. The procession of dishes was a macabre parade, each platter an earnest to the perversion of culinary artistry. I stood at the threshold of the dining room, the sights and sounds of merriment within forming a grotesque tapestry. Griffin, seated at the head of the table, raised his glass to me, a silent acknowledgement of my enforced role in the evening's proceedings. As the doors closed behind the last of the servers, sealing the guests in with their ghastly repast, a numbness settled over me. I had crossed a line from which there was no return. The manor, with its insatiable appetite for cruelty, had claimed another part of me, one I feared I would never regain. Back in the shadows of my cellar, the familiar chill of the stone against my skin, I realized the true extent of my imprisonment. It was not just the physical chains that bound me, but the psychological tethers that Griffin had so deftly woven. I was ensnared in a web of fear and obligation, and with each passing day, the struggle to maintain a grasp on the fragments of my identity grew ever more arduous. The manor, a Pandora's box of gilded horror, had forced my hand, stained it with complicity, and in doing so, had eroded another layer of the person I once was. Betrayal of flesh indeed, for I had betrayed my own, and the cost of that treachery weighed heavy on my spirit. Chapter 8: the unseen brand. A hush had fallen over the manor, a stillness that seemed almost reverent, if not for the sinister undercurrent that ran like a rill beneath the silence. In my chamber, a word far too gentle for the stone crypt that held me, I sat motionless, the chains that fettered me to the wall as familiar as the scars they had etched into my flesh over countless days and nights. Evelyn, the name I once answered to, seemed like a distant whisper from another lifetime. The pain and fear that had been constant companions were now dull echoes, their edges blunted by the relentless march of time and torment. It was there, in the oppressive quiet, that the door to my cell creaked open, and Griffin stepped through the threshold. His silhouette was a darker patch against the murky light that spilled in from the corridor. He regarded me with a clinical detachment, as if I were nothing more than an object within his domain. "Evelyn," he began, the words rolling off his tongue with a practiced ease, "I trust you've come to understand the futility of resistance." I lifted my head, my gaze meeting his. "There's nothing to understand," I said, my voice a husky whisper from disuse. "Understanding implies there's something to be gained from the knowledge." Griffin's lips twitched into a semblance of a smile, but his eyes remained cold. Such resignation. I must admit, I didn't expect you to succumb to the reality of your situation so gracefully. A hollow laugh escaped me, the sound brittle and short-lived. Grace? There's no grace here, only the end of hope, the acceptance of the inevitable. He circled me then, the soft echo of his steps a stark contrast to the sharpness of his scrutiny. "You see, Evelyn, every soul within these walls bears my mark, an unseen brand that binds them to my will. But you've been a challenge, a delightful diversion from the monotony of compliance." I remained silent, the weight of his words pressing down on me with a heaviness that threatened to crush what little resolve I still possessed. I had fought, rebelled, clung to the notion of escape with a desperation that bordered on madness. But now I felt the final vestige of that determination slip through my fingers like sand. Griffin paused in his pacing, standing before me. "Tonight, you will join us for dinner. Not as a server, nor as an unwilling guest," he said, his tone carrying a dark mirth, "but as a witness to the conclusion of your own tale." The shackles fell from my wrists with a clatter, but the sensation of freedom was an illusion. I understood the gesture for what it was, a transfer of chains from the tangible to the intangible, a deeper, more insidious form of captivity. I followed Griffin from the cell, my steps automatic, as if my body were no longer my own, but a marionette dancing to the tune of his whim. We traversed the corridors, the grandeur of the manor mocking me with its beauty, a façade that hid the rot within. The dining room doors opened to reveal the assembled guests, their faces alight with anticipation. They were a mosaic of greed and indulgence, each one a patron of the perverse spectacle that unfolded within these walls. Griffin guided me to a seat, the chair an ornate piece that seemed to mock my disheveled appearance. I watched as the courses were served, each dish a grotesque masterpiece that catered to the debased appetites of the diners. As the meal progressed, the conversation among the guests grew more animated, their words a tangle of innuendo and veiled references to the night's entertainment. I felt their eyes on me, their gazes sharp and assessing. "You're quite the topic of conversation, my dear," Griffin murmured, leaning in close enough for his breath to brush against my ear. A phoenix, rising from the ashes of her own defiance. I turned to face him, my expression blank. "A phoenix burns before it rises," I replied. "I've done nothing but smolder." The evening wore on, a macabre dance of civility and savagery intertwined. As the final course was cleared, Griffin rose, his presence commanding the attention of all within the room. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced, his voice resonant and clear, "tonight we bear witness to the culmination of a journey. Evelyn, once a thorn in our side, has come to embrace her place among us." The guests turned to me, their applause a hollow sound that filled the room. I remained seated, my hands folded in my lap, my eyes fixed on a point beyond the walls of the manor. For in that moment, as Griffin basked in the glow of his perceived victory, I understood the true nature of the unseen brand he spoke of. It was not the mark of physical pain or the scars that marred the body. It was the erosion of self, the surrender to a fate that could not be altered by will or want. As the guests departed, Their laughter and conversation, a fading chorus in the wake of the evening's events, I remained motionless. The unseen brand seared into my soul, a silent surrender to the horror that had become my existence. There was no escape, no hope, no phoenix to rise from the ashes. There was only the manor, Griffin, and the path to ruin that I had walked to its bitter end. Chapter 9. The Feast of Horrors. The chamber in which they prepared me was at once sterile and suffocating, its walls lined with mirrors that reflected the hollow-eyed specter I had become. The hands that tended to me were meticulous and impersonal, as if I were a mannequin in their expert care. Griffin had uttered no word since he had declared my participation in this final banquet. His silence was more unnerving than any threat. As the attendants scrubbed my skin with astringent soaps that stripped away layers of grime and defiance, I thought of the open fields of my youth, where the wind danced through the wheat like waves upon the sea. That life was a distant shore now, so far removed from the abyss into which I had descended. "Keep still," one of the attendants, a woman with hair the color of polished mahogany, instructed as she worked a comb through my tangled locks. Her voice was devoid of empathy, hardened by the countless others she had prepared before me. I complied, my body responding with mechanical obedience while my mind drifted. The innocence I had once known was not just lost, it was annihilated, ground to dust beneath the heel of this grotesque reality. The reflection that stared back at me from the mirror was a stranger, all traces of the girl named Evelyn erased by time and terror. A gown was brought forth, a garment of exquisite design, its fabric a crimson that mirrored the blood spilled within these walls. Slipping it over my head, the fabric caressed my skin, a mockery of tenderness. This was not attire for a celebration. It was a costume for a sacrificial lamb. "You must eat," another attendant, a young man with sharp features and a dispassionate gaze, said as he held a plate of meager fare. It was imperative that I be presentable, not just in appearance but in vitality. The feast demanded it. I accepted the food with a numbness that had become my constant companion. The flavors were bland on my tongue, each bite a reminder of the feasts I had unwillingly served, the grotesque parody of nourishment that would soon be my legacy. As the final touches were administered, Griffin finally made his appearance. His figure filled the doorway, his aura one of dark triumph. "Ah, Evelyn, you do look the part," he remarked, his voice smooth as the silk I wore. "I am no actor in your twisted theatrics," I said, my voice steady despite the storm of emotions within. "This is not a role I chose." Griffin circled me, his gaze taking in every detail of their handiwork. "But it is a role you were born to play. You, who have defied me at every turn, will now be the centerpiece of my greatest work." His words were a poison, each syllable a needle into my heart. I longed to lash out, to defy him once more, but the chains that bound me were no longer physical. They were the chains of circumstance, of a fate that had been woven from the moment I set foot in his domain. The march to the dining room was a procession of the condemned. My feet moved of their own volition, carrying me toward the opulent doors that stood as gatekeepers to the final act. The guests awaited, their faces ravenous with the hunger for spectacle. I entered the room, the rustle of my gown a whisper against the hush that fell. Eyes turned to me, some with a glint of perverse anticipation, others with a shadow of something that might have been compassion, had it not been so thoroughly extinguished. Griffin took his place at the head of the table, his presence an eclipse that cast a pall over the assembly. "Tonight, we dine on defiance," he declared, his voice a crescendo that filled the room. "We savor the spirit that has fought against the tides of fate and now joins us in eternal homage." The feast began, a cavalcade of courses that paraded before the guests. Each dish was an affront, a testimony to the corruption that had infiltrated the marrow of the manor. And I, seated at the center of this maelstrom of decadence, could only watch as the spiral of doom drew tighter around me. As the meal reached its zenith, Griffin rose once more, lifting his glass in a toast that was a dirge for the remnants of my soul. "To Evelyn, who has shown us that even the brightest flame can be extinguished in the darkness of our appetites." The guests echoed his sentiment, their voices a chorus of the damned. I sat, motionless, my hands folded in my lap, my eyes vacant. There was no fight left in me, no flicker of hope in the oppressive shadow of the unseen brand that marked me as one of Griffin's collection. I had reached the point of no return, the event horizon beyond which there was no escape from the gravitational pull of my demise. As the feast of horrors reached its conclusion, I resigned myself to the inescapability of my fate, the final act of a play written in blood and bound by the inexorable chains of destiny. Chapter 10. A Muted Farewell. In the quietude of my enclosure, I, Evelyn, sit with the quill trembling between my fingers, the candlelight casting elongated shadows that dance morbidly upon the walls. This journal, my silent confessor, bears witness to the final elegy of my existence. With each stroke of ink, I etch a muted farewell to the life I once embraced with joy and abandon, a life that is now but a relic of a more innocent time. The cadence of my heart, erratic and weary, struggles against the encroaching void. It knows, as do I, that the curtain is poised to fall on the harrowing performance of my days. There's a peculiar clarity that accompanies the approach of one's denouement. It is both enlightening and terrifying, illuminating the path walked and the inevitable terminus that beckons. I pen these last words not in search of redemption or solace, for those are luxuries that lie far beyond my reach. Rather, I seek to envelop my thoughts in a shroud of acceptance, to cloak my spirit in the armor of acquiescence as I confront the final act that awaits. The stillness of my chamber is disrupted by a gentle rap at the door, a harbinger of the commencement of the end. The attendant enters, a figure shrouded in the customary attire of servitude, her eyes averted in a gesture of feigned deference. "Evelyn, the hour has arrived," she murmurs, her voice a soft intrusion upon the silence. I nod, setting the quill aside, my fingers smeared with the indelible testament of my journey. "I am prepared," I respond, my tone devoid of the tremor that writhes within my core. "May I speak frankly?" she inquires, her voice a notch above a whisper, and I discern a tremble in her demeanor. "Speak, for your words can do no further harm," I assure her, my gaze fixed upon the abyss that stretches before me. Her eyes meet mine, and in them I perceive a glimmer of camaraderie amidst the resignation. "There are none who walk these halls who do not know your tale, Evelyn. You have become the siren of our shared damnation, the voice that dared to sing against the tempest. The air between us thickens with the weight of unspoken truths, the resonance of shared suffering. For a moment, we are united in the acknowledgement of our respective fates, bound by the invisible fetters of circumstance. You honor me, I concede, though honor is but a faded hue upon the canvas of my soul. But my tale is not one of triumph. It is a lamentation, a dirge for the lost and the forsaken. You have illuminated the darkness," she insists, a fervency seeping into her words. "Even in your silence, you speak volumes." I regard her with a solemnity that belies the chaos that claws at my insides. "Then let it be known that Evelyn Hartley, once a handmaiden of unwavering spirit, does not go gentle into that good night." She inclines her head, a silent valediction, and withdraws, leaving me to the solace of my solitude. The candle sputters, a feeble protest against the oppressive gloom, and I am left to ponder the paradox of my existence. As the echoes of the attendant's footsteps recede, I am enveloped in the stark realization that my final hours are upon me. The feast, my feast, looms like a specter, an unyielding monolith of inevitability. I have been sculpted by the hands of fate, chiseled into a figure of tragedy and despair. I rise, the fabric of my attire grazing the cold stone floor, and approach the looking glass that has borne witness to my transformation. The visage that stares back at me is a ghostly semblance of the woman who once walked with head held high, who once dreamed of love and light. The hourglass of my life has been inverted, the sands of time cascading toward their final resting place. There is no turning back, no path that leads away from the precipice upon which I stand. So with a heart leaden with the weight of impending doom, I commit these final words to paper, an earnest to the indomitable will that even now refuses to be quashed by the darkness. Let it be known that Evelyn's voice, though quelled by the cruel hand of destiny, resounded with a truth that could not be silenced. This is my farewell, not to the world, but to the vestiges of the girl I once was. For when I descend to the dining hall, when I take my place at the table of my own requiem, it is not Evelyn who will be consumed by the ravenous maw of the feast. but the echo of a dream that once soared upon the wings of hope. The flame of the candle flickers one last time before succumbing to the inexorable call of the void. Darkness envelops me, a cloak woven from the threads of despair and resignation. Yet, within its folds, I find a semblance of peace, a quietude that settles upon my soul, like the first snow upon a desolate landscape. And so I embrace the end, not with a heart aflame with defiance, but with the muted acceptance of one who has journeyed too far to be swayed by the illusions of escape. This is my muted farewell, penned in the twilight of my existence, as I step into the feast of horrors that awaits. Chapter 11: The Final Supper. The gilded dining hall of the manor stretched before me, its tables laden with a decadent spread that belied the malignancy festering at its core. The walls, adorned with portraits of the manor's ancestors, gazed down with stoic indifference to the scene below. I, Evelyn, stood at the precipice of my end, enveloped by the clutches of an aristocracy whose appetites were as perverse as their lineage was esteemed. Beside me, Lord Griffin, the orchestrator of this grim pageant, radiated a presence as cold as the marble underfoot. His hand rested lightly on my back, a gesture of proprietorship rather than comfort. "Tonight, my dear, you shall transcend," he whispered, his voice a melody of hidden daggers. The guests, an assembly of the realm's most debauched souls, turned their gaze upon me with an unsettling hunger. Their finery, a mockery of civility, could not mask the bloodlust that lurked within their eyes. The candlelight flickered, casting their shadows upon the walls like grotesque puppets enacting a vile play. "Griffin," a voice called out, the speaker a woman vested in velvet, her smile as sharp as the jewels at her throat. "You promised us a spectacle, and I see you've not disappointed." Griffin's laughter, a sound devoid of genuine mirth, filled the room. "Patience, Lady Marrow. The feast is yet to reach its crescendo." I felt my resolve crumble as the moments stretched taut, each second a thread in the tapestry of my undoing. The chatter around me, a blend of veiled threats and lascivious promises, swirled in the air like a noxious fog. A hush descended as the final course was announced, the words hanging heavy with an unspoken dread. Servants filed in, their eyes downcast, bearing dishes that gleamed ominously in the dim light. My heart thundered against my chest, a frantic drumbeat heralding the approach of the inevitable. As the course was unveiled, a collective gasp rippled through the guests. Griffin leaned in, his breath a hiss at my ear. "You see, Evelyn, there is no greater honor than to be immortalized in the memories of the noble." The dish before me was a grotesque masterpiece, a creation that blurred the lines between artistry and atrocity. I could not avert my eyes, transfixed by the horror of what my existence had been reduced to, a mere morsel to be consumed by the ravenous jaws of the elite. The woman in velvet, Lady Marrow, raised her fork with a grace that belied the savagery of her intentions. To the end of defiance, she toasted, her voice resonating with a wicked delight. The other guests echoed her sentiment, their words a din that drowned out the silent screams clawing up from the depths of my soul. I stood at the center of it all, a silent effigy to the cruelty that mankind was capable of when unbound by the constraints of decency. Griffin's hand tightened on my back, a vice that held me in place as the feast commenced. The air was thick with the scent of spices and wine, a perfume that could not mask the stench of my despair. As the guests indulged, their laughter and conversation crescendoed into a symphony of the macabre. I felt my spirit ebb, the final vestiges of hope extinguished beneath the oppressive weight of their debauchery. In that moment, my mind splintered, fracturing into 1,000 shards of resignation. My life's narrative, once vibrant and flush with promise, had been snuffed out, the final chapter written in the ink of my own blood. The dining hall, with its grandeur and opulence, became a tomb, the air heavy with the unspoken acknowledgement of my demise. Griffin, ever the master of ceremonies, presided over the event with a detached air of satisfaction. As the feast drew to a close, the guests rose from their seats, their hunger sated by the consumption of my legacy. Griffin's grip on me lessened, and I was left adrift in a sea of desolation, my existence nothing more than a footnote in the journal of the manor's sordid history. I, Evelyn, the handmaiden who had dared to dream beyond the confines of her station, was no more. In her place stood a hollow shell, a vessel emptied by the unyielding darkness that had consumed her from within. The final supper had ended, and with it, the last embers of the fire that had once fueled my defiance. As the guests departed, their voices a fading echo in the recesses of the manor, I remained, a specter haunting the space between life and the void that awaited beyond. Chapter 12. Echoes in the Dark. The cellar, a cavernous maw beneath the manor, was silent but for the scuttling of rats and the distant, muffled sounds of revelry from the floors above. Here, where the air was thick with the must of neglect and the iron tang of fear, I lay, Evelyn, a withering husk upon the cold stone floor. The darkness was absolute, a shroud that enfolded me in its oppressive embrace, and yet it was the laughter from the grand dining hall that carved the deeper void within my chest. The echoes of merriment, punctuated by the clinking of fine crystal and the subtle brush of silk against silk, seeped through the cracks of my prison, a cruel reminder of the world I had once walked, a world now forever out of reach. Their glee was a piercing light in my darkened world, a balefire of what had been and what would never be again. The voices, a clamor of privilege and satisfaction, were the dirge to my dwindling spark of life. I could discern the timbre of Griffin's voice, a smooth baritone that conducted the symphony of hedonism with the ease of a seasoned maestro. More wine, a guest called, his voice buoyant with the intoxication of the evening's excesses. Let us drink to the Baron's health and the unforgettable experience he has bestowed upon us this night. A chorus of approval rose to answer the toast, an undulating wave of sound that seemed to fill every crevice of the manor with its resonance. The revelers knew nothing of the price of their pleasure. The cost weighed in flesh and spirit in the bowels of the very estate that cradled their debauchery. Their laughter was a gale that whipped through my cell, chilling me to the bone. I felt the final threads of my being unravel, pulled apart by the gale of their joy and the hurricane of my despair. "Griffin, you have outdone yourself," another voice chimed, a woman's lilting soprano that held a razor's edge. "The novelty of this evening will linger on our palates for years to come." Griffin's reply was smooth as aged brandy. "My dear Countess, it pleases me to provide an experience that satisfies the refined tastes of my esteemed guests." Their words were like daggers, each one plunging into the remnants of my heart, twisting with the knowledge of their vile implications. The cellar, my silent tomb, resonated with the resonance of their oblivious cruelty. I could feel the life within me ebbing away, a candle succumbing to the inevitable snuff of the wind. The chill of the stone beneath me seeped into my bones, a cold that was both numbing and acute, a paradox of sensation that mirrored the duality of my existence within these walls. Incredible, a new voice marveled, a young man's tenor ripe with the thrill of the forbidden. "The Baron's feasts are the stuff of legend, but to be a part of one is to witness genius." "Genius," I whispered to the darkness, the word a bitter laugh devoid of humor. "Is this the title afforded to madness and monstrosity now?" My voice was a mere ghost, a specter that failed to reach beyond the confines of my stone enclosure. The revelry above continued, unabated by the shadow of the tragedy playing out beneath their feet. As the laughter and conversation drifted down to me, a cruel symphony that played upon the strings of my forsaken spirit, I realized the catastrophic failure not just of my own hope for salvation, but of the very essence of humanity that should have bound these people to some semblance of compassion. There was no rescue from this abyss, no night to challenge the darkness, no deity to part the sea of cruelty. There was only the cellar, the darkness, and the echoes of a feast that would haunt the corridors of the manor long after the candles had been snuffed out and the guests had departed. I, Evelyn, once a being of fire and defiance, had been reduced to nothing more than an echo in the dark, a fading memory of resistance that would soon be lost in the diary of the manor's grim history. As my final breaths labored in my chest, the distant sounds of the final supper became a lullaby of sorts, a perverse comfort in the face of the encroaching void. And as I surrendered to the enveloping darkness, I offered a silent plea that somewhere, somehow, the tale of my plight might serve as a balefire of warning to those who tread too close to the path of ruin. Chapter 13. The Legacy of the Damned. The manor, with its labyrinthine corridors and grandiose chambers, echoed with the quietude of a crypt as I, Sarah, a mere handmaiden, meandered through the lower quarters. The air was heavy, laden with a sorrow that the merriment of the previous night's feast could not dispel. My duties were simple and menial, yet today they felt like a solemn procession through the remnants of some great tragedy. It was in the cold embrace of the cellar where I chanced upon the leather-bound journal, its pages splayed open as if gasping for breath. The script within was fine and hurried, the ink a stark contrast to the pallor of the paper. My heart raced as I recognized the handiwork of Evelyn, the handmaiden whose abrupt disappearance had birthed whispers amongst the staff. I could scarcely believe my eyes as they traced the lines of text, each sentence a revelation more harrowing than the last. Her words, a litany of the unspeakable, clawed at the walls I had built around my understanding of the world within these manor walls. As I delved deeper, the silence of the cellar bore down upon me, a weighty shroud that seemed to absorb the shock and horror that welled within my chest. Evelyn's account painted a portrait of Lord Griffin that dismantled the facade of nobility he presented to the world. The revelation of the journal's contents forged a tumult within me, a storm of conflict and dread. I could no longer turn a blind eye to the atrocities that had unfolded beneath the very roof that sheltered me. My hands trembled with the magnitude of the decision that lay before me. The choice to conceal or reveal the truth was a solitary battle, fought in the dim light of the cellar. The pages of the journal beckoned, a siren's call that promised chaos and retribution should the words reach the ears of those beyond the manor. As the weight of my discovery bore down upon me, the distant sound of footsteps approached, heralding the arrival of another into the cellar's grim embrace. It was James, the stable hand, his features etched with concern. "Sarah, what ails you?" James inquired, his voice tinged with worry as he noted the journal in my hands. I glanced up, my eyes wide with the gravity of what I had uncovered. "James, this," I gestured to the journal. "It's Evelyn's. It speaks of things so vile and iniquitous that they rend the very fabric of our reality here." James stepped closer, his gaze following mine to the open pages. "Evelyn's? But she's gone. What does it say?" I took a deep breath, the air chilling my lungs as I steeled myself for the confession. "It tells of her final days, of the true nature of the feasts that Lord Griffin so relishes. She became one of them, James, a victim to his depraved appetites." A pallor crept over James's face as the implications of my words settled in the air between us. "Lord Griffin? But he's a nobleman, respected and feared. What can we do with such knowledge?" The cellar, once a mere storage for wine and provisions, had become the crucible of our resolve. "We must act," I asserted, the quiver in my voice belying the certainty of my words. "If not for us, then for Evelyn, for all those who may yet fall prey to Griffin's monstrous desires." James nodded, a mute agreement that sealed our newfound pact. "Then we shall take it to the magistrate," he decided with a grim determination. "The law must be brought to bear upon this house of horrors." Our exchange marked the beginning of a mournful reckoning, the first step on a path that promised no return. As we ascended from the cellar, the journal clutched firmly in my grasp. The legacy of Evelyn's words resonated within me, a lighthouse of truth that pierced the darkness of ignorance and fear. The manor loomed above us, its facade a witness to the ruin that festered within. But now, armed with the revelations of the journal, we moved with a purpose that transcended our station, our every step an act of silent rebellion against the tyranny that had held sway for far too long. Lord Griffin, unaware of the storm that gathered beyond his sight, continued his charade, a puppeteer blissfully ignorant of the strings that had begun to fray. The echoes in the dark had found their voice, and the legacy of the beep, the very heartbeat of the manor's sinister secret, would soon beat no more.
Thank you for listening. Visit StoryWave.ai to start creating your own generative audiobooks. Smash that like button, subscribe, and share for more.